Welcome to the Quiet Chapters. Tonight's sleep story brings us to a city that holds memories softly in its palms. Paris. On one gentle evening, beneath rain-washed lanterns and quiet cobblestone streets, something unusual happened. For just a single moment, time paused. Raindrops waited mid-air. Café windows held their reflections perfectly still, and whispers hung quietly in doorways. And in this soft pause, the city invited one weary traveler, perhaps you, to step out of the world's rush and into something kinder. Tonight, there's no hurry. There's only this quiet space, a memory waiting gently, a story softly unfolding. Let yourself settle now. Let the world slow down with you. And let Paris show you what happens when time stands beautifully still. Once upon a very quiet evening in Paris, the kind of evening where the rain falls politely and the wind speaks only in sighs, time forgot to keep ticking. It wasn't dramatic. There were no clocks shattering, no stars blinking out, no sudden stillness that made the world gasp. No, it was more delicate than that. More like the city simply exhaled. Somewhere in the 6th arrondissement, a café light flickered behind rain-speckled glass. A waiter paused mid-step, his hand holding a saucer with a single madeleine, steam curling from the tea in soft spirals. But he didn't notice the stillness. No one did. No one except one traveller who had arrived not by plan, but by a gentle mistake, the kind the universe makes when it wants you to rest. You had wandered quite unintentionally down a street you'd never walked before. The map on your phone had frozen. The sky had turned to pearl, and the shops had begun to close their shutters as if the whole city were tucking itself in. And then there it was, the café, small, quiet, bathed in amber light, its windows fogged slightly like breath on old spectacles. Inside, a book rested open on the counter. A candle burned low, and the door, somehow, had already opened just a sliver, as if expecting you. You stepped in with the gentleness of someone entering a memory they didn't know they had. The bell above the door did not ring. The sound it made was softer, something between a hush and a heartbeat. The room was warm, not just in temperature but in tone. It smelled of bergamot, beeswax and something floral, perhaps old perfume, perhaps violets pressed into paper. Chairs lined the windows like quiet companions. A velvet curtain fluttered gently, though the window was closed. At the far end of the room sat a woman, older than the building itself it seemed, with silver hair that curled softly like punctuation. She looked up, not surprised, not startled, just pleased, as if she'd known you'd be arriving exactly then. "You're just in time," she said, and her voice was low and velvet soft, like pages turning in a beloved book. You opened your mouth to reply, but found that words were unnecessary here. So instead, you nodded and chose a seat beside the window. Outside, the rain still fell, but the drops seemed suspended in motion, not frozen, just slowed, as if the weather itself had leaned back for a moment to watch the evening unfold. The woman moved behind the counter, not hurried, not idle. She selected a teacup, porcelain, pale blue, with a gold rim worn down in places. Then she poured a steaming infusion from a teapot shaped like a swan. You didn't ask what kind of tea it was. It didn't matter. It was the sort of tea that doesn't come with a name, only with a feeling. She placed it gently before you, and you wrapped your hands around it like someone returning home. The warmth seeped through your skin and into your breath. The scent was calming. Something about it reminded you of library shelves, warm coats, late afternoons at your grandmother's table. Not a specific moment, just the kind of moment you never knew you missed until it returned. There was no menu, no music, no clocks, just the ticking silence of time forgetting itself. For you. And then the woman spoke again. "We only open when someone needs us," she said, gently wiping a glass with a linen cloth. "Usually," she added with a smile, "when the world has asked a little too much." You looked around. There were no other customers, no waiters, no receipts, just you, your tea, and a softness you hadn't realized you'd been missing. She poured a cup for herself and sat across from you. "No rush," she said kindly. "We're very good at waiting." And indeed, the whole room seemed to agree. The candle flame didn't flicker. The steam rose in a slow, confident ribbon. Even your thoughts, usually so tangled and hurried, began to untie themselves, one breath at a time. Perhaps you spoke. Perhaps you didn't. It doesn't matter, because in that little café, words weren't the point. Presence was. The woman picked up the book from the counter. Its cover was plain, but embossed faintly in gold were the words, "For those who almost forgot." She opened it to the middle and began to read, not out loud, just softly, as if reading allowed the story to slip into the air like mist and settle gently in the corners of the room. And as she turned the page, you felt the weight of your day, its effort, its thinking, its pushing, drift further away. You sipped your tea, you watched the rain that didn't quite fall, and you let yourself believe, for just a moment, that perhaps time had paused not just for the city, but for you. The café had no name written above the door, but you would come to think of it as the Café en Rue de Lune because the street, though unnamed on any map, seemed always to carry the light of the moon whether it was visible or not. Later, you'd wonder if the street existed only at night. It felt like the sort of place that disappeared at sunrise, folding itself back into Paris like a secret tucked into a coat pocket and forgotten until needed again. Inside, the stillness continued, not empty, not cold, but full of warmth, of breath, of quiet life that didn't need to be announced. You sipped your tea, and its warmth traveled not just through your hands, but through something deeper, a thread that led somewhere beneath memory. The woman had returned to her place behind the counter. She didn't hover. She didn't ask questions. She simply allowed. There was a wall lined with old postcards, some faded, some curled at the corners, each one pinned gently, as if it had chosen to stay. No frames, no labels, just places, moments. A seaside town with parasols from another century. A fountain in Florence at dusk. A canal you couldn't name, but somehow knew. Each image carried the hush of something too tender to be remembered all at once. Beside them was a shelf of teacups, no two alike. Some were chipped, others glazed in soft blues or faded greens. One had a tiny gold star painted inside, only visible when empty. You wondered if the cups had stories, or if the stories had chosen the cups. On another wall, a mirror reflected the candlelight, but didn't reflect you. You noticed this only in passing, not with alarm, but with curiosity. In this place, reality didn't seem to follow the same rules, and you didn't mind at all. The woman returned, placing a small plate on your table, a delicate madeleine, still warm. Memories are easier to remember when you're not trying, she said, as if continuing a conversation that hadn't yet started. You smiled without needing to respond. She poured a fresh cup of tea for you, then sat down with a notebook in her lap. The pages were covered in inked lines, part writing, part sketches, part something else. She caught you looking, and without hesitation she said, "They're fragments, little pieces people leave behind. Words they forgot they once needed. I keep them here just in case someone wants them back." She held the notebook close to her heart for a moment, then set it aside as if it knew its place. You looked again at the postcards, at the teacups, at the quiet mirror that didn't insist on reflection. Everything in this cafe seemed to be made of memory, not in the way a museum is, but in the way a lullaby is, soft, unspoken, felt more than understood. You looked down at your cup and noticed something swirling gently in the tea. At first you thought it was steam, but no, it was an image, faint but unmistakable, a street light reflected in a puddle, a pair of feet, yours perhaps, stepping gently across it. Then laughter, not heard, but sensed. You blinked, and the tea was still again. The woman said nothing. She only smiled and took a slow sip from her own cup. You wondered how long you'd been there. But then again, that was the whole point, wasn't it? Time wasn't keeping track of you. The chair beneath you held your weight like an old friend. The warmth of the teacup lingered in your palms. The air smelled like rain and lemon blossom, and in that moment, the line between waking and dreaming blurred completely. You weren't asleep, but you weren't entirely here either. You were floating somewhere just beside yourself, wrapped in lamplight and memory and steam. When you opened your eyes, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The woman rose and walked to the back of the room, opening a drawer you hadn't noticed before. From it, she drew out a small envelope. It was sealed with wax. She held it out to you with both hands. You took it. There was no name on the front, no address, just one line, written in handwriting that felt vaguely familiar. For the moment you're ready. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. You slipped it into your coat pocket where it settled as if it had always belonged there. No goodbyes were said. There was no bill to pay, no thank you required. When you stood and walked to the door, the candle by the window flickered once, as if nodding to your departure. You stepped back out onto Rue de Lune. The rain had stopped. The air was cool and clean, and behind you, the café was gone. Not vanished, just tucked away again. Paris in the rain is not the same city as Paris in the sun. It breathes differently. It thinks more slowly. Its footsteps become softer, more considerate. Its colours shift, greys and silvers and faint golds, like watercolour paintings half dreamed. And so you walked, not quite knowing where you were going, but not needing to. The street beneath your feet glistened, as though the rain had polished the path just for you. Windows flickered with lamplight. Balconies bore small puddles, tiny mirrored skies resting between the wrought iron curves. Even the café behind you, now vanished, felt less like a place you'd left and more like something folded into your coat pocket to be remembered later. The envelope rested there still. You didn't touch it, didn't need to. Its presence was enough. Up ahead, the street curved and the city tilted slightly, as if Paris herself were lowering her voice to whisper. You passed an old bookstall, its canvas awnings sagging with water. No one manned it, and yet the books sat open, untouched by the rain. Each page turned softly in the breeze, as if the city itself was reading. You paused, drawn to a photograph in a warped gilt frame. It showed a woman, smiling, seated on the edge of a fountain. Behind her, the Louvre. But the frame wasn't what held your attention. It was the feeling, that faint, flickering hum of recognition, like hearing a song you don't remember knowing the words to, but your body remembers how to hum along. You moved on. The rain began again, but only gently. The kind of rain that doesn't rush you indoors, but walks beside you like an old friend. The city's sounds grew muffled, footsteps on stone, the occasional car hissing by. And from somewhere high above, the drip of water from a windowsill into a tin bucket, steady and soft. It reminded you of being young, not a specific moment, but a texture, the sound of quiet places, the smell of warm pavement and damp wool, the way adults spoke softly after long dinners, the feeling of being safe without knowing why. You turned a corner, and suddenly the world felt smaller, not narrower, but closer. Everything more intimate. The buildings leaned in, the street lamps hummed, and your footsteps felt less like walking and more like gliding through someone else's dream. You found a small iron bench sheltered beneath a chestnut tree, its leaves trembling under the soft weight of water. You sat, and the city sat with you. You looked up and saw your reflection not in a mirror, but in the window across the street. For a moment, you imagined the person inside looking back was not quite you, but a gentler version, softer at the edges, one who didn't worry quite so much, one who knew how to rest. You closed your eyes, not because you were tired, but because the world felt better that way. Behind your eyelids, the rain became music. The wind curled its fingers through your hair, and the quiet wrapped itself around you like a scarf someone once knitted for you with love. You imagined yourself inside that window, in a warm room, tea cooling beside an open book, a cat curled in sleep at your feet. The version of you who lived there was not busy. She was not behind. She was not trying to fix anything. She was simply being. And outside that imagined room, you, the dreamer, smiled. After a while, or perhaps no time at all, you opened your eyes. The rain had stopped again. The bench beneath you was dry, though the leaves still dripped gently overhead, and in your coat pocket the envelope warmed against your side. You placed your hand there, not to open it, but to thank it. The lights of Paris shimmered now, not with urgency, but with invitation. A soft voice inside you, your own perhaps, said, "Go slow. There's nowhere to be, only places to feel." And so you rose, and you walked, and the city walked with you. You crossed a tiny bridge over a canal, its stone sides worn smooth by time. A violin played in the distance, not a performance but a memory. One soft note, drawn like silk, then another. You didn't search for the source, Some things are better left unchased, better heard than held. You paused at the center of the bridge. The water below was still, not perfectly, but peacefully. Your reflection met you there, not demanding, just present, and you let yourself stand in that moment, half real, half remembering, as time very gently began to move again. The rain had returned, but only in the way a lullaby returns, softly, quietly, as if continuing a story you'd already begun dreaming. Paris shimmered in that gentle hush. The reflections in the puddles were no longer of buildings, but of light and memory and breath. You wandered without intention, led by instinct rather than destination, turning corners that felt familiar, passing windows that looked as though they had waited years just to be glanced at once more. And then you saw it. A doorway tucked between two shuttered shops, its brass handle worn to a soft gleam. A building you didn't remember from before, and yet something about it felt known. There was no sign, no bell, just the door and you. You opened it. The hallway was dim and dusted with time, not neglected, but lovingly still, like a place paused mid-thought. The air was scented with wood polish and parchment and something floral, perhaps dried lavender or the memory of someone who once wore it often. A narrow staircase wound upward, its banister smooth under your palm, and at the top, a door, slightly ajar, and behind it, the unmistakable quiet of a room that had waited a long time without complaint. You stepped inside. A writing desk sat beneath the window, its surface bare except for a small glass vase holding 2 sprigs of dried heather. A bookshelf stood along one wall, not filled, but chosen. Titles you knew, some you had loved, a few you hadn't thought of in years. There was a sense that this room had once belonged to someone not unlike you, someone who loved quiet, who kept things tucked away, who had left this space behind not out of urgency, but with the slow grace of someone who trusted the room would keep its own peace. You moved gently, drawn to the writing desk. It had 3 drawers. The top 2 were empty, but in the third, a photograph, black and white, soft at the edges, faded slightly, as if viewed through memory itself. It showed a woman, mid-30s perhaps, seated on the windowsill of a Parisian apartment, one hand resting in her lap, the other holding a book open to a page she was clearly not reading. But it wasn't the woman that caught your breath. It was the scarf draped across her shoulders, a pattern you remembered only vaguely, a weave of soft greys and navy blue, a scarf once tucked around your neck many years ago, on a morning you had nearly forgotten. Until now. You sat, not hurriedly, not in shock, but in that quiet way people sit when something familiar has returned without warning, like an old friend stepping into a dream. You turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back, faded and elegant. To remember only when you need to. That was all. No date, no name. But somehow that felt right. You looked around the room again, and this time you saw the details you'd missed. A teacup with a faint gold rim, a book with a pressed violet inside, a coat folded carefully over the back of the chair, and on the windowsill, a little brass key resting in a pool of light. You didn't know what the key opened, perhaps the drawer itself, perhaps nothing, or perhaps something not made of wood and metal at all. You took the photograph, slipped it gently into your coat pocket, next to the envelope from the café. They rested there together, not heavy, but present. Anchors, perhaps, or invitations. Outside, the rain slowed until it was no longer rain, just a soft mist curling around the rooftops like breath. The window creaked slightly, as if to say, "It's time." You stood. You looked once more at the room, not to memorize it, but to acknowledge it. The kind of look you give to someone you once loved quietly and still carry with you in your softer hours. You left the key on the sill. You closed the drawer gently with both hands. And then you walked back down the stairs, the hush of the room lingering in your coat like the scent of lavender long after the bloom has faded. Paris waited for you outside. The street was glistening, the air faintly perfumed with sleep. You stepped out, and something shifted in the air, not loudly, but deeply. A sense that the city remembered you now. That time, once paused, had not resumed, but softened. And from the corner of your mind, a voice, not yours, but known. Now, let the dreaming begin. You walked without thinking, not aimlessly but gently, as if the city itself were carrying you. The street beneath your feet didn't feel like stone anymore, but something softer, like memory, or water, or the kind of cloud you once imagined touching as a child. Paris had grown quieter still. The lamps had dimmed, shadows no longer stretched, they hovered. You passed a row of shutters, all closed, but each one whispered, not in words but in feelings, warm kitchens, perfumed letters, conversations that never needed to be finished. The buildings no longer looked like buildings, they looked like sighs. And somewhere behind you, time stood once more, only now you didn't notice. There was no urgency now, no weight, no past or future tugging at your sleeve. Just this moment, just this breath, just the hush of a city that seemed to know you were on the edge of waking, but had chosen not to wake. You passed a puddle, looked in, saw not your reflection but stars, tiny silver pinpricks on the surface, some flickering, some still, as if the sky had fallen just low enough to rest for a while in your path. You walked around it, not out of fear but reverence, and the stars rippled, then settled again. The air grew cooler, not cold, just calm. Each breath you took felt like silk drawn through your lungs, each step a lullaby sung by the earth itself. Somewhere a church bell tolled, but the sound arrived not like a chime but like a memory draped in velvet. It echoed, then softened, then folded itself into silence. You turned a corner, or perhaps didn't. It was hard to tell now. The city had blurred at the edges, its streets bending like ribbons, its rooftops melting into night. A cat crossed your path, tail high, footsteps silent. It paused beside you, looked into your eyes, then carried on as if you'd passed its test without knowing there'd been one. You smiled, not with your mouth, but with something behind your ribs. Ahead, you saw a stairway, old stone, worn smooth by 1,000 footsteps. You climbed it as if you'd done it before, in another dream, or perhaps in a memory you never lived but always carried. At the top, a single street lamp flickered. Its light poured down like honey, and in its circle stood a bench. You sat, not because you were tired, but because it felt like exactly the right thing to do. The sky above Paris was velvet now, deep and soft, speckled with silver freckles. The kind of sky you might once have imagined before you knew the names of stars. You leaned back, let your gaze drift upward, and let go. Of time, of names, of need. Everything slowed. Thoughts, like petals, floated gently away. There was no story now, just the space between the lines. A lull, a hush, a held breath that never needed to be released. You closed your eyes, not from sleepiness alone, but from surrender, letting the dark behind your lids become a stage for flickering dreamlight. Shapes came and went, not things but feelings wrapped in form. The scent of warm paper, the touch of sunlit sheets, the sound of distant laughter echoing across a stone courtyard. They didn't ask to be named, they asked only to be felt, and you did, deeply, silently, like a tree feeling the wind without needing to follow it. You weren't quite asleep yet, but you were close. Very close. So close that dreams began introducing themselves before the final word was spoken. One bowed, another curtsied, a third waited patiently beside you, offering nothing but presence. And so you waited with them, in stillness, in breath, in the comfort of not needing anything but this. Time did not restart with a sound. It returned quietly, not with the clatter of clocks, but with the hush of someone pulling up a blanket, adjusting a pillow, or turning a page slowly. The world did not hurry to resume. It simply shifted, softly, like a candle flickering lower. Paris breathed again, but not louder, just deeper. The bench beneath you remained warm, your shoulders relaxed in a way you hadn't noticed they were holding tension. Your palms rested open in your lap, as if they'd been asked to hold nothing at all. And in your coat pocket, the envelope waited, still unopened, still whole. You reached for it, paused, then rested your hand there, not to read it, but to honor it. Because sometimes you don't need to know the words to feel their meaning. Sometimes just knowing the message exists is enough. You rose from the bench, not because you had to, but because the city had begun to stir, not in motion, but in feeling. The lamp above you hummed. A light in a distant window flicked off, and the moon, ever watchful, softened into a pale blur. You stood there for a while, long enough for a breeze to pass, for a curtain to stir in a window overhead, for a bird to call once, then fall silent again. Then you turned and began to walk once more, not forward, not backward, just gently onward. The sky was just beginning to pale at the edges, not morning yet, but the idea of it. You breathed in deeply. Paris still smelled of rain and stories, and you carried none of the day with you. Not yet, not now. You were still tucked within the night, still folded into the moment where time had paused for you, just long enough for something within you to soften. You closed your eyes one last time. Let the stillness settle. Let the hush grow deeper. Let the thoughts fall further away. There was no need for one more word, no need for an ending, only this breath, only this stillness, only this sleep. Because now, time may move on very gently, that you don't have to, not yet, not now. You may drift, you may rest, you may sleep. And in the quiet corner of Paris, somewhere behind ivy-covered doors, a candle flickers softly in the dark, waiting for the next dreamer to arrive.